Hi guys, Mr. Ridgway here, and welcome back to another episode of Ridgway History. So today we're going to be looking at the United States, and we're specifically going to be looking at the start of the Cold War. Let's get going. So our objectives for today, and what we're going to deal with specifically in this mini lesson, is really the decisions made by the United States in the context of the different motivations for both the United States and then the Soviets in the Cold War. Okay, and specifically here, as it says, President Truman's decisions, because again, Truman was at least the first president to deal with kind of the Cold War situation after World War II. Okay, so explain Truman's decisions in the context of the U.S. and Soviet Union's motivations behind the Cold War. All right, so if you've never heard about the Cold War, you're also going to get an introduction to that here as well. The Cold War is a 50-year, essentially, and you could probably argue continuing kind of war today between the United States and the Soviet Union. But we'll get into that here in just a second. So our essential questions here that we're going to look at. How do you define a clash, really, between two countries? Is it economic, social, philosophical? What's the perspective and the lens that you're going to use to examine a particular conflict? Because the way that you frame things really matters. And then also, how do political leaders solve foreign policy problems? And as you'll see here, definitely the events of the Cold War are going to put quite a few demands on the United States, and especially the thinking that the U.S. is going to have to kind of use going forward. Okay, so before we get going anywhere first, let's define what the Cold War is, okay? The Cold War, the basic definition I can essentially give you is that it's a non-shooting conflict, okay? So it never broke out to be hot, okay? That's like bullets flying and those kind of things, between the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia. Okay, kind of between the years 1945 to 1990, there's still issues between the United States and Russia today. Kind of some people look at it as a continuation of the Cold War. Maybe, sure. Certainly evolved, though, into some new aspects that weren't there before. But it never was, as it says here, a hot or shooting war. But be aware with that. There's still lots and lots and lots of fighting and death and some pretty awful, bits of violence that happen in the Cold War. It's just not between the United States and Russia directly. It's done by proxy, meaning like it happens in other locations. Maybe they support other sides that are involved in a couple of, like in a war in another area. But the Cold War defines really the 1950s all the way through the 1990s. It's kind of like 9/11 today. Like it really kind of shaped how the United States looked at the world and the decisions that it made and those kind of things. Okay, so who caused the Cold War? That's a simple question, but there's lots of very, very complicated answers here. Okay, so again, this kind of the perspective that we take here really defines kind of how we see the conflict. So here's Europe. Okay, at the time we can see the Soviet Union in red. Germany, of course, is cut into two after World War II, and then we see Europe over here on the side. So what do you say causes the Cold War? Well, if you're going to blame the Soviet Union, you're going to look at probably two big areas. At least that's what most historians have done. Some historians say that it's simply all the Cold War is an ideological conflict, and you say the Soviet Union causes it because it wants to cause eventually the goal is a worldwide worker revolution that communism naturally wants to spread. And so the Soviet Union tried to expand, and that's how we get the conflict. Other people say, no. It's not about like communism or ideology at all. All it is simply the Soviet Union trying to expand its influence into parts of Eastern Europe because it's sick of getting invaded by Napoleon, Germans in World War I, Germans in World War II. Maybe. The United States, though, let's say you blame the United States. What you blame in this case is that the U.S. is, I guess if you want to take an economic perspective, all it is the U.S. and its greedy capitalist fingers trying to, intrude onto Europe and trying to spread its influence over there. And in particular, you would blame things like the Marshall Plan. Okay, now You can also blame the U.S. on ideological grounds. Maybe it's just the United States hates communism and doesn't want that to spread. Okay, and maybe you could say it's not either side's fault. It's a military thing. You have like two gigantic, ripped bodybuilders in a room, and eventually, human nature just says like, yep, they're gonna try to start out benching each other, or who can squat more. And so you're basically just like viewing the United States and the Soviet Union as these two massive superpowers who are just in a race for a race's sake. So was it maybe inevitable? I don't know. It's certainly maybe some combination of these things. But again, perspective matters here, right? So the question is then, well, what are you left with? You have the Soviet Union, who's now expanded into Eastern Europe, and then things get a lot more, I guess, intricate then. In 1949, the Soviet Union also gets the nuclear bomb. Soviet Union also gets the nuclear bomb. Gets nuclear bombs, and that is when a new reality kind of sets in the Cold War, and that's called MAD. It means mutually assured destruction. In MAD, basically, it means that if a nuclear war happens between the United States and the Soviet Union, they're both going to get wiped out. It's, again, mutually assured destruction, okay? But Truman's really struggling here, and the United States kind of has a decision to make, because as the two superpowers in the world, the U.S. is going to have to respond to its rival, the USSR. You can't fight a nuclear war because, again, MAD, you would lose too, but you also can't do nothing, because that simply means the Soviet Union just rolls you over, and that's it. So what does Truman do? He has two specific answers. One was called the Truman Doctrine, okay, and then the other was called Containment, and they're kind of related. So the Truman Doctrine. The U.S., according to the Truman Doctrine, would support any country after World War II to prevent communism from spreading there. And this happened in two particular instances, in Greece and Turkey, where the United States basically supplies a whole bunch of a kind of a combination of military and economic aid. Okay, and then number two, that kind of blends into the general policy that the U.S. is going to have during the Cold War. Its decision that it's going to make is to follow something called containment. And this is really, really important. Okay, so this kind of goes to like this question today of like, what should the U.S. do? Should the U.S. Or do in regards to terrorism? Should the U.S. try to contain, well, what's left of ISIS at this point? How do we respond to, the threats of like terrorism spreading online? What do you think? How should it be defeated? And again, this is like a really complicated question, because there's no right answer, but there's lots of like kind of big consequences that can happen about the decisions that you in particular take. If you choose something else, that means you really can't do maybe another option you thought of. So what do you think? So once you've maybe pondered that question, let's talk about containment. Okay. Containment was a foreign policy developed by one of Truman's aides. His name was George Kennan, who worked for the also kind of worked for the State Department. George Kennan, and kind of his thinking, that's a picture of him right up there, he said that the way to deal with the Soviet Union was to constrict it and not allow it to expand any more than what it like currently owned, but not to be like actively trying to end it. And what George Kennan basically goes on to say, and a whole bunch of other kind of policy proposals and speeches, is that the Soviet Union would essentially fall apart from some of its own weaknesses. And true to now, like the credit of hindsight, we can say he was exactly right about this when we look at the 1990s. But that's a little far off. Okay, so there's some strengths and weaknesses to this. Again, any strategy you pick, right, there's going to be consequences as to what you decide to do. The strength is there's no offense. Now, that sounds kind of strange, but that's a good thing, okay? Not because simply that means that you are not trying to actively, poke the Russians to, like, see if they get annoyed or, what they do, at least in theory, if you're only playing by the rules of containment. There's also no risk of MAD here, okay? Now, the weaknesses of this, it's inherently reactionary. Okay, if you're going to play by the rule of containment, that essentially means that you're going to put the ball in the Soviet Union's court and say, all right, Soviet Union, your move. But the thing is that you have to respond to any time that the Soviet Union tries to break outside of its kind of like sphere of influence. Okay, so basically this kind of goes in, like this kind of then will get the United States involved in a lot of conflicts overseas that it might not have wanted to get involved in, such as the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or like several other many conflicts around the world that were kind of a problem. So containment does have some consequences. This will also tie into a later theory that gets proposed called domino theory, that basically essentially proposes that if the United States does not stop a country from falling to communism, all of its neighbors around it will fall to communism as well. And so this kind of lends more credence to the philosophy of containment, that you should do this because if you don't, other places are going to go the same way that that particular country may have gone. Okay, so containment, it's really, really important. And let's talk about a few ways that containment happens. And this kind of goes along with the Truman Doctrine as well. Okay, so the Marshall Plan. Let's talk about the Marshall Plan. So again, here's Europe. Okay, developed by the U.S. General Marshall, pushed by Truman. It was a plan for an economic reconstruction of Europe after the devastation of World War II. And the United States gave tons and tons and tons, billions of dollars in the Marshall Plan to basically rebuild Europe and get it back on its feet. Now, the point of the Marshall Plan was not only to help, obviously, Europeans, but hopefully to prevent them from turning to communism. And again, that's because like when people get desperate, as shown by Hitler, when economic times are really, really desperate, they tend to turn to very radical ideas. Okay, and generally it was really successful. Europe rebounded after World War II, and Europe has now, the EU is a thriving economy, and has been for many, many years. The problem, though, is that with this Marshall Plan is how it's perceived. And Stalin and the Soviet Union see it as an example, really, of the U.S. and these like greedy imperialist fingers trying to like reach in and influence things. And even though the Soviet Union is offered to like be a part of the Marshall Plan, like the United States offered, it refused, and they don't participate. So what happens eventually, and this kind of will go on to our next activity that we're doing, in response to the Marshall Plan and really what Stalin saw as U.S. interfering in things, Stalin goes on to blockade West Berlin from the rest of Germany. Okay, and so we'll do some more on that later and talk about why and how the U.S. is going to respond to that. Alrighty, so hopefully that was helpful for you in getting kind of a good general start to the Cold War, talking about why Truman is going to make the decisions around containment that he does in the Marshall Plan and things like that. And until next time, I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.